Our first panelist will be Professor Julian Agyeman from Tufts University, although it looks like, Julian, you've been a lot more places than Tufts, and very widely published and fascinating work, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Secondly, from the great state of Alaska, the enormous state of Alaska, we have Robin Bronin, who is the executive director of the Alaska Institute for Justice, and she'll be speaking second. And finally, we have Juan Delara, and Juan, we're behind his picture, we see the sun rising over Los Angeles. He is at the University of Southern California. I commented this morning that as the moon was setting, it was red, and the reality of those of us in California is suddenly the loss of water and the presence of fire and the loss of power frequently has really hit us very, very hard. And even for people with substantial resources, it's tough, but for people who are really struggling, it's been a very tough and increasingly difficult and challenging time. Dr. Agyeman, do you mind going forward? And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you also to the conference organizers. You've done an excellent job. So I'm just going to jump straight in with the concept of spatial justice. Usually I contextualize this in light of my work on what I call just sustainabilities. How do we improve people's quality of life now and into the future in a just and equitable manner while living within the limits or constraints of ecosystems? But before I start, I would like to offer a land recognition. I'm speaking from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, to their past, their present, and their future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. There can be no spatial justice unless we acknowledge and recognise the lands on which we are presently situated. I want to give you a few thoughts on urban planning. The most elegant and simple definition is managing our coexistence in shared space. We share space. We need to coexist better in that space, whether we're talking about environmental issues, transportation, housing, or other conflicts. But that shared space is increasingly complex. We are increasingly different. We live in cities of difference. How do we coexist in shared space when we are so different from each other? Second thing I want you to think about as I talk is, what's the relationship between belonging and becoming? All of us in the urban planning, sustainability, resilience kind of fields, we're always talking about what the city can become. We are forgetting who belongs or who is allowed to belong in the city. How do we recognize? How do we reconcile? How do we offer reparations for those who've been traumatized? How do we think about difference, diversity, inclusion, and justice? Instead, what we think about is, how do we become smart, sharing, resilient, sustainable? That's good. We must always dream, but we've really got to think about who gets to belong. And also, the final thought is, we hear a lot in urban planning, especially from the Congress for New Urbanism, about human scale planning. Well, I want you to put an E on the word human. I want humane scale planning. I want planning for human dignity, planning for empathy, planning that helps us be better citizens, be better ancestors, and to coexist in shared space. So let me jump straight into spatial justice. David Lammy, British Member of Parliament, came up with an elegant definition. Just as social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class lines, spatial justice requires they're not distributed geographically. None of our American cities have a wall like there is in Jerusalem, but we have freeways, we have creeks, we have railway lines. On one side they live and on the other side you live. Their life chances are very different to yours, their life expectancies. Harvard University have suggested that your zip code may be more important than your genetic code in terms of your life opportunities and your lifespan. But let's, as an urban planner, let's get down to brass tacks. Let's think about spatial justice on streets. We've got two streets here. On the left, Södervägen in Gothenburg, and on the right, Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge. They could not be more spatially different. They're identical width. On Massachusetts Avenue, the principle of allocation of rights is basically, have you got a car or a vehicle, and how big is your vehicle? The biggest vehicles have, it seems, the most rights. Not so much in Sweden. In Sweden, they've democratized the streets. They have imposed spatial justice on the streets, such that cyclists, tram users, pedestrians have the same rights as the vehicular users who are only allowed to the left of that fence. What does this say to the kid growing up and walking to school each day on these two different streets? How is the kid wired differently on these two streets? Now, we do know from work that was done in the 70s and early 80s in San Francisco that street traffic and social interaction are absolutely linked. On the right, you see a lightly trafficked street with many more social interactions, friendships across the street than on the heavily trafficked street. What's the implication here? We know who lives in the neighborhoods with the heaviest traffic, and we know who lives in the neighborhood with the lightest traffic. There is a spatial injustice built into our cities, and this, in many ways, has come through urban planning, which I have called the spatial toolkit of white supremacy. We have used urban planning to segregate, sort, categorize other different groups of people. But, you know, in the US, we are getting better. We're thinking about these things. This is Bloomberg's New York. On the bottom right is a People Street outside of Macy's. We can do this. We can absolutely do this. We have to have the political will and confidence to do it. But what these pictures show me as well is urban planning must be about what is possible, not what is probable. If we keep doing what we've probably done forever, we won't move out of this tired paradigm that we're in now. But we're very good, as I said, at disbelonging, at stopping people from belonging, whether it's on the top left, the stopping kids using the skateboard along the edge of that ledge there, whether it's stopping homeless people lying down on benches by putting armrests, the egregious studs that some architects have put on buildings to stop homeless people sleeping there, even designing whole buildings with two doors, the rich doors for the rich to go up to their penthouse suites at the top floor, and the poor doors down the back alley for the affordable housing people, increasingly who are in these big buildings because of inclusive zoning policies. Bottom left, incredibly cynical. That's a bridge in Seattle. There were homeless people there, so the city decided, let's put bike racks there. Let's get rid of the homeless people using bike racks. Thankfully, the good cyclists of Seattle said, not on our watch. We've got a problem with homelessness. It needs policy and resources, not the cynical use of sustainability infrastructure. So we create spatial injustice through hostile and defensive architecture at the smaller scale. But at the larger scale, we drove freeways through neighborhoods. This is the freeway separating West Oakland from downtown Oakland. We're using the term now racist infrastructure. Some people might say, but Julian, how can a road be racist? Well, no, the road itself isn't racist, but its position, where it goes, can be informed by racist thinking. And I'm pleased to see that as part of the Biden infrastructure package, there is money for reconnecting communities by removing some of these racist infrastructures. So at the larger scale of the city, we've done all kinds of things in the name of zoning, of progress through roads, of racialized covenants. All of these things, redlining, have imposed a spatial order on the city that is derived from white supremacist thinking. My friend Elijah Anderson at Yale has done some interesting work on what he calls the Cosmopolitan Canopy. Most of the time he says we're walking down the street, we are trying to ignore other people, but he says there are spaces in cities, and he calls them Cosmopolitan Canopies, and this one on the cover here is Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. These are spaces where people let down their guard. They eat other cultural foods. They watch a ball game. They talk. These spaces of engagement are really important. Contact theory says the more times people have or the more opportunities people have to meet people across difference, the more likely they are to be tolerant and offer human dignity. So contact theory, very important. So a question that I have is there a role for urban planners and planning and urban designers in creating cosmopolitan canopies, those spaces where people treat each other with dignity and as equals? Children's spaces, dog parks, food spaces, these are all very good cosmopolitan canopies. How do we make more of them? Don't get me wrong, they're not going to eradicate racism, but they are spaces of engagement where we can begin to come together and learn about each other. One urban planning method that is very common now is this notion of complete streets. This urban design movement, policy movement that looks at changing our streets so that they are multi-use. They are people streets rather than just conduits for vehicles. But one problem that I have is, the great thing is we are looking at decentering the automobile in cities. We are looking at traffic reduction policies. But will that result in enhanced livability only for the most privileged, or will it result in enhanced livability for all? 15-minute city. Who's going to benefit from that? But I think we need to go deeper. What is a complete street? A complete street is not just a physical entity. It's a social entity. As Doreen Massey said, places, and streets are places, are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. But most urban designers don't think that way. They think of the physicality. And I show you two pictures here. On the left is a street in Athens. We can't design that social ecology. That happens through human interaction. So I want to think about complete streets as not disconnecting the street from the social, from the symbolic, from the discursive, and from the historical. But yet LA, your beloved LA, Richard and Juan, until very recently, LA, that has a complete streets policy, used to ban street vending. Southeast Asian, Latinx cultures depend on street vending. It's part of the DNA of the city, yet LA banned it and had a complete streets policy. How can you have a complete streets policy if you ban this? It is now permitted, it's now possible, but for several years they had a complete streets policy and banned the use of street vending. Now, one of the problems that we really, I think, are going to experience with this idea of complete streets and then complete green, sustainable neighborhoods is what we're calling greenlining. This isn't redlining, specifically racist, but it costs to live in these traffic calm streets. It costs a lot of money. And my book series through Routledge on equity, justice, and the sustainable city really starts to document this. Incomplete streets, just green enough, green gentrification. In fact, the book Green Gentrification talks about how greening whitens neighborhoods, not through racism, but through the socioeconomic fact that it costs a lot of money. And one of the key metrics for urban sustainability, or if not the key metric, is walkability. How walkable is my neighborhood? And there's an app for that, because there's an app for everything now. And that app is called WalkScore. Who owns the app? Redfin, the realtor. Let's just take stock here. We have compromised, commodified sustainability so that it now sells. So if you've got a 90 plus out of 100 WalkScore, your neighborhood is pretty tony and the rents will go up and the house prices will go up. I want everybody to have complete sustainable green neighborhoods. But currently in the US, we have commodified green such that you have to buy to get in. Urban parks, let's think about urban parks. Parks are a product of design, management, and programming. Much of that, though, is not done by people who are in the community. It's been done maybe 100 years ago, or even for newer parks, it's done recently. But do those people who do parks design, do they look like the community? Parks managers, do they look like the community? Park programmers? I want to see co-design, co-management, and co-programming, co-production of parks and public spaces. That will get us towards spatial justice. One big problem we have in Boston, and you might know that we are going to have a mayor of color in Boston, and she will weave a new narrative for the city. But a lot of our organizations, especially these old friends of the park kind of organizations, are dominated by older, white, empowered, wealthy interests. What happens when the governance of a city changes, as in Boston, and yet power still lies with a lot of these organizations? How do we get immigrants, the new Bostonians? Boston is a majority minority city now. Where are they on these powerful organizations like Friends of type organizations? Now, if we want to think about engagement and belonging, and we want to think about spatial justice, let's also think about, where do immigrants go for recreation? And the great quote here, I think one of the reasons that that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park on the River Charles because it looks like home. People bring images of distant elsewheres, and they gravitate to places that are familiar. In Copenhagen, they tried something different. They tried to design in encounter. They tried to design in contact theory by creating a park, a fantastic park. I've been there, Superkyland Park, where they asked the community, what do you want in the park? And they said, we want artifacts from where we're from. And, you know, if you walk through the park, there's everything from 100 or so different cultures. This is a statement of presence. This is really good for designing in encounter. And I want to finish by just talking about the need to move on from pure demographics. You know, some organizations say, oh, what's the demographics of the community? That's not enough. That just tells you the physical bodies that are in the community. We need to drill down on that. We need deep ethnographies. We need to understand communities. And we don't need to produce them ourselves as urban planners. We want co-produced deep ethnographies with communities. Imagine community and urban planning department working together on an ethnographic analysis of a locality. And we have, in my journal, Local Environment, we have a great article, Ethnographic Understanding of Ethnically Diverse Neighborhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. This is the work of a great group of people at the Department of Landscape at the University of Sheffield in England, and they have a transnational urban outdoors research group that have done a Refugees Welcome in Parks resource book, recognizing that refugees and asylum seekers are more traumatized generally than the usual populations. What kind of spaces do we need for people who have suffered from trauma? Trauma-informed design, trauma-informed public spaces are what we need to think about. But we only get to that through this notion of deep ethnography. So what I've tried to do here is really to give you an idea of some of the things that we're thinking about, I'm thinking about in urban planning, and how we can inculcate spatial justice rather than the very spatially unjust cities that we have at present. Thank you.
Julian, thank you so much. As you were talking, I was thinking about a change to a complete street in the town where I live actually meant that all the traffic moved out to all the residential neighborhoods, and we now have trucks going through, and I don't think anyone feels like it's much of an improvement, although the traffic lights on the complete street are better. There is a highly technical term, it's initialed RAS, and as we all know, only about a good 1/3 of Americans do not drive. Too young, too old, disabled, don't have the funds to do it, don't. A study that was done looking at the worst driving, the one that ignores traffic controls and others the most, are the wealthiest cars that are the wealthiest. It has, I won't say the whole words, but it's the rich A syndrome, as it's called. And but it reflects this, if you will, class and economic warfare that goes on, and the sense of elites that do not need to comply. And you've really touched on this indirectly all the way through. Would you want to comment for a minute before we go on to Robin?
What, on ARS specifically, or? But
just on the issue of, for a long time I thought the problem really was we don't design right, but I really hadn't adequately grappled with the fact that there are deep vested economic interests and status interests that keep the status quo, if you will. And I just want to If you might comment on that.
I mean, if you look at the statistics, road traffic accident statistics, again, like everything in the United States, they are heavily racially located. If you are Latinx, Asian American, African American, you are far more likely to be hit as a pedestrian, as a cyclist. And it's in part because the roads in those neighborhoods those segregated neighborhoods in which we have found, minorities living, tend to have the bigger roads, as I showed you on one of my slides. They tend to have bigger roads with more complex intersections. They are not generally traffic calmed. And the whole point of traffic calming is to slow traffic down. My road here is a 20-mile-an-hour zone in Cambridge. It's a nice road. It's got bump outs. It's got a raised table so that people don't speed down the road. But try finding those features in lower income neighborhoods. And that's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where, we are much more politically aware, I think, and yet we still have the problems, rampant gentrification, great differences between neighborhoods. So urban planning, as the spatial toolkit of white supremacy, that needs to be undone. And we need to undo it through zoning changes. We need to undo it through acknowledgement of redlining issues. Great work from Portland State just recently showing that redline neighborhoods are hotter today than other neighborhoods. The legacy of, white supremacist urban planning is coming back, and it's always here. We need to undo it. And part of what we do in planning school is to make students aware of this, and that we can undo these effects, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of political will and courage to do that.
In the later discussion, I'll come back and ask about climate change, because the redlining that makes hot neighborhoods, saltwater incursion, and other issues are destroying the tree cover at the same time. And we'll look forward to it.